And he came to me and said, Dick, what did I do? I said, you jerk, I can't fire anybody.
For nearly 8 decades, Dick Van Dyke has been America's sweetheart, the eternally youthful entertainer who danced on our screens and filled our homes with laughter. From the Dick Van Dyke Show to Mary Poppins, he's been the face of wholesome entertainment, the man who never seemed to age or lose his infectious smile. But at 99 years old, Dick is finally ready to share the stories he's kept hidden behind that famous grin. The 6 names he's revealed aren't just colleagues who rubbed him the wrong way. They're people who fundamentally changed how he viewed friendship, trust, and the entertainment industry itself. Some were legends he looked up to. Others were partners he thought he could count on. And one? Well, that story might be the most painful of all, because it's about the man he saw in the mirror during his darkest hours. These aren't tales of Hollywood tantrums or ego clashes. They're deeper than that. Stories of promises broken, dreams deferred, and the quiet moments when the people you trusted most left you standing alone. After nearly a century of keeping these feelings private, Dick Van Dyke is finally setting the record straight. Mary Tyler Moore wasn't just Dick's television wife. She was the woman who unknowingly captured his heart during the golden years of the Dick Van Dyke Show. When the series premiered in 1961, Mary was a fresh-faced 25-year-old, 11 years younger than Dick and relatively unknown in Hollywood. Dick himself had questioned whether she was right to play his wife, telling creator Carl Reiner that she seemed too young for such an important role. But once the cameras started rolling, something magical happened. The chemistry between Rob and Laura Petrie felt effortless and genuine. What viewers didn't know was that for Dick, those feelings extended far beyond the script. He developed real romantic feelings for Mary. Emotions he kept carefully buried, but that colored every scene they shared together. The set was like a small family, and Dick and Mary spent countless hours together rehearsing and filming. Their professional relationship deepened into genuine friendship, but for Dick, it was always something more. He later admitted that having to hide his true feelings made every day on set emotionally exhausting. Mary was professional, talented, and kind, but having to maintain that careful distance while pretending to be her loving husband on camera created constant tension that only he could feel. Mary herself seemed to sense something unspoken between them. Years later, she would joke in interviews, "The amazing thing is we never had an affair. I always thought it was a terrible waste." That lighthearted comment revealed more than she perhaps intended. Both of them knew that something real could have developed if circumstances had been different. As the show progressed and Mary's star continued to rise, Dick found himself watching her transform from co-star to sensation. The press adored her style and wit. When the Dick Van Dyke Show ended in 1966, so did their daily connection. Mary went on to create the Mary Tyler Moore Show and became a television icon. Dick continued his career, but he never quite got over what he called the terrible waste of those unexpressed feelings. In his heart, Mary Tyler Moore would always represent the path not taken and the love that remained forever unfinished. Rose Marie came to the Dick Van Dyke Show as a seasoned professional with decades of experience in vaudeville and comedy. When she was cast as Sally Rogers, she believed she would be the show's sharp-tongued, quick-witted career woman who could match any man joke for joke. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly the show's focus would shift toward the home life of Rob and Laura Petrie, leaving her character with fewer punchlines and less screen time. Rose Marie had every reason to expect a prominent role. She was a veteran performer with impeccable comedy timing who had been entertaining audiences since childhood. But as Mary Tyler Moore began to capture audiences' hearts, the writers naturally gravitated toward developing the Petrie marriage, which meant less focus on the office dynamics where Sally Rogers lived. The shift wasn't dramatic, but Rose Marie noticed every missing line and reduced scene. She took her concerns directly to creator Carl Reiner, explaining that she felt her talents were being underutilized. Reiner's response, though probably meant to be reassuring, only made things worse. He reportedly told Rose Marie and Mary, "You both have great legs. They just prefer to look at hers." What was intended as a lighthearted comment came across as dismissive. Rose Marie wasn't competing based on appearance. She was fighting for recognition of her comedic abilities. Dick found himself caught in an uncomfortable position. He deeply respected Rose Marie's talent, but he also understood that audiences were connecting with Mary in a way nobody had anticipated. He could see Rose Marie growing more distant and frustrated with each passing season, but there was little he could do to change the show's dynamics. Despite her disappointment, Rose Marie never let her frustration affect her performance. She continued to deliver every line with perfect timing and maintained her professionalism. But the easy camaraderie of the early days was replaced by a more complex dynamic, where everyone was aware of the underlying tensions. Years later, Rose Marie would speak candidly about feeling overshadowed during the Dick Van Dyke Show. She didn't blame Mary personally, but the pain of being pushed aside in favor of someone younger and newer never fully healed. For Dick, watching this transformation was a lesson in how success could complicate even the closest professional friendships. Before Dick Van Dyke became a household name, he was half of a unique comedy duo called the Mary Mutes. His partner was Phil Erickson, an experienced mime who saw potential in the young radio DJ and suggested they team up for something completely original. Their act was unlike anything audiences had seen. They performed elaborate pantomime routines set to popular records, creating comedy gold without saying a single word. When they met in 1947, Dick was just 22 and hosting a local morning radio show. Phil recognized something special in Dick's natural timing and physical comedy instincts. They worked relentlessly, sometimes performing 5 shows a night, 7 nights a week. In 1950, they set a record with 35 performances in a single week. Dick felt like they were building something extraordinary together. Their big break came in 1951 with the Mary Mutes Show on WSB-TV in Atlanta. When they were invited to perform on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1952, Dick knew they had truly made it. Their slow-motion football sketch became a nationwide sensation, and for the first time in his life, Dick felt like he belonged in show business. Then, without warning, it all ended. In 1953, Phil Erickson simply walked away. There was no big fight, no creative differences, no scandal. He just decided he was done with show business and wanted to pursue a different life. For Dick, who thought they were just hitting their stride, the decision was devastating. One day they were rehearsing their next routine, and the next day Dick was trying to figure out how to continue without the partner who had given him his start. The abandonment, because that's how Dick experienced it, left deep scars. The years that followed were difficult as Dick took various television hosting jobs and tried to establish himself as a solo performer. He had to rebuild not just his career but his confidence. The experience taught him about resilience, but it also made him more guarded about depending on others. Phil Erickson faded into obscurity while Dick went on to become a legend, but the memory of that early partnership never completely left him. It was his first real lesson in how show business could break your heart, not through betrayal or cruelty, but through the simple reality that not everyone shares the same dreams or commitment. Carl Reiner was more than just the creator of the Dick Van Dyke Show. He was the man who essentially shaped Dick's entire television career. The series was based on Reiner's own experiences, and originally Carl planned to star in it himself. But when CBS executives expressed concerns, it was Reiner who made the decision to hand the starring role to Dick just 18 days before filming began. At first, the relationship worked beautifully. Carl wrote scripts with precision and wit, directed with clear vision, and guided the show with expert hands. Dick was grateful for the mentorship and direction. But as the show found its rhythm and began winning awards, Dick started to feel constrained by the very structure that had made him a star. Despite Dick's name being in the title, and his face being the one America welcomed into their homes each week, the Dick Van Dyke Show remained Carl Reiner's creation and vision. Every major decision flowed through Carl. Scripts, casting choices, and the overall direction were all tightly controlled by Reiner, leaving Dick feeling more like a well-treated employee than a true creative partner. Dick began to chafe at the limitations. He had ideas about his character and the show's direction, but they had to be filtered through Carl's approval. The show's enormous success, ironically, made Dick feel even more trapped. He was the face of something beloved, but he couldn't truly shape it. The tension came to a head during the new Dick Van Dyke Show in 1971. Carl returned as a writer for this new series, which was meant to be more modern and socially conscious. But when CBS decided to pull an episode dealing with controversial themes, the network made the decision without consulting either Dick or Carl. For Carl, this interference was the final straw. He left the show immediately, walking away without prolonged drama. For Dick, Carl's sudden departure was devastating. Without Reiner's writing and guidance, the show lost its heart. The ratings continued to decline, and what had started as an opportunity to do something bold ended up being a slow-motion failure. The new Dick Van Dyke Show lasted only 3 seasons, ending in 1974. The experience taught Dick a valuable but painful lesson about the price of working in someone else's creative shadow. He would always be grateful to Carl for launching his career, but he also carried resentment about never being allowed to truly shape the thing that made him famous. Walt Disney gave Dick Van Dyke the role that would make him a global icon. In Mary Poppins, Dick played Bert, the cheerful chimney sweep who danced across London rooftops and into cinema history. But the experience left Dick with wounds that would never fully heal, because while Walt opened the door to stardom, he also left Dick exposed to criticism without offering protection or support. From the beginning, Dick had to fight for every aspect of his involvement. Disney initially didn't want him to play the dual role of Mr. Dawes Sr., the elderly bank director. Dick wanted that second part so badly that he paid for his own screen test and even removed his false teeth to look older. Walt eventually agreed, but the way it was handled made it clear that Dick had to earn every opportunity in the Disney universe. Then came the accent, the infamous Cockney accent that would follow Dick for the rest of his career. What most people don't realize is that Dick wasn't given proper dialect coaching. His accent coach was Irish and, by his own admission, not much better at Cockney than Dick was. No one on the set ever pulled Dick aside to suggest the accent might be problematic. They let him walk into cinematic history with a vocal choice that would become a punchline for decades. Dick didn't realize how bad the accent was until the film was released, and critics mocked it mercilessly. Decades later, Dick would joke about having the worst Cockney accent in movie history. But beneath the laughter was genuine hurt. He had worked incredibly hard on that performance, completing the grueling step-in-time dance sequence in 23 takes at age 41. What made it even more painful was that Dick hadn't even been paid for playing Bert. He worked essentially for free because he believed so deeply in the project. When the backlash over his accent began, Walt Disney did nothing to defend him. No public statements, no behind-the-scenes support, no effort to redirect the narrative toward Dick's considerable contributions. Mary Poppins became a massive success, but that success was forever tinged with embarrassment. Every time someone imitated his accent, Dick was reminded of how exposed he had been. The experience fundamentally changed how Dick approached future projects. He had believed that loyalty and hard work would be enough, but learned that even the great Walt Disney could forget about you when criticism started flying. The final name on Dick Van Dyke's list isn't a co-star or director. It's the man he saw in the mirror during the darkest years of his life. While millions welcomed him into their homes as wholesome entertainment, Dick was privately battling demons that nearly destroyed everything he had worked to build. The problems began in the 1960s, right as the Dick Van Dyke Show was making him a household name. The pressure to always be on and maintain his success began wearing on him. He started drinking, initially just to relax at social events. But for Dick, what started as occasional social drinking quickly evolved into serious dependency. By the 1970s, the man who had brought joy to millions was drowning in private misery. He became moody, withdrawn, and angry. Characteristics completely foreign to the Dick Van Dyke audiences knew. In 1972, he courageously checked himself into a hospital for treatment, but recovery from addiction is rarely a straight line. The emotional damage went deeper than alcohol abuse. Dick's marriage to Margie Willett was crumbling under the pressures of fame and his increasingly erratic behavior. Margie hated the Hollywood lifestyle and wanted quiet, private life. But Dick couldn't walk away from the career that had consumed his identity. In the midst of his marital problems, Dick began an affair with Michelle Triola. What started as innocent conversations quickly developed into a serious relationship that lasted decades. Dick found himself living a double life, trying to be a devoted husband and father while maintaining a secret relationship. The guilt and shame of this deception ate away at Dick's sense of self. Here was a man beloved for portraying the ideal American husband and father, while in reality he was betraying the very values he represented on screen. The cognitive dissonance between his public image and private behavior created a psychological burden that was almost unbearable. When Dick and Margie divorced in 1984 after 36 years of marriage, it felt like confirmation of his failure as the man he had always believed himself to be. What tormented Dick most wasn't the public consequences. His career continued to flourish, but the private knowledge of who he had become. Fame had slowly eroded his sense of authentic self until he no longer recognized the man behind the smile. In his later years, Dick began speaking with remarkable honesty about this period. He wrote candid memoirs, spoke at recovery events, and used his platform to help others struggling with similar issues. The same vulnerability that had made him a compelling performer became the foundation for his journey toward redemption and self-forgiveness. At 99 years old, Dick Van Dyke has outlived most of his contemporaries and witnessed the complete transformation of the entertainment industry he helped shape. The 6 names on his list, Mary Tyler Moore, Rose Marie, Phil Erickson, Carl Reiner, Walt Disney, and himself, represent more than just professional disappointments. They tell the story of a man who learned that success comes with a price, that trust can be fragile, and that sometimes the people who lift you up are the same ones who can let you fall. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Dick's journey isn't the pain he experienced. It's how he chose to respond. Rather than becoming bitter, he used his experiences to develop greater empathy and wisdom. The man who felt abandoned by his comedy partner became someone who valued loyalty above all else. The performer who felt controlled by his creator learned to fight for creative freedom. The star who was left defenseless by a studio legend became more protective of other vulnerable artists. Dick Van Dyke's legacy isn't just the laughter he brought to millions of homes. It's the example he set of how to survive the complexities of fame while maintaining your humanity. He showed that it's possible to acknowledge your failures without being defined by them, to forgive others without forgetting the lessons they taught you, and to find joy again even after experiencing profound disappointment. As he continues to dance and perform well into his 10th decade, Dick carries with him the wisdom of those 6 difficult relationships. In Hollywood, where many careers end in bitterness and regret, Dick Van Dyke chose a different path, one that led to grace, acceptance, and understanding that sometimes the most important lessons come from the people who hurt us most. That might be the greatest performance of his remarkable life.